Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Himanshu Arora from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today we are going to study a module titled Living Arrangements Among Elderly from the paper Biosocial Gerontology. First of all, let's start with the learning objectives of the module. Through this module, you will be able to comprehend the concept of living arrangement of elderly. Secondly, to understand the determinants of living arrangements and to know the impact of modernization on living arrangement of elderly and to analyze the patterns of living arrangement of elderly among different countries. Now, I'll give you a glimpse of the topic through brief introduction. During the past decades, there has been a growing concern over the living arrangements of elderly. Living arrangements of elderly is usually explained in terms of the type of family in which the elderly live, the headships they enjoy, the place where they stay, and the people they stay with, the kind of relationship they maintain with their kith and kin, and on the whole, the extent to which they adjust to the changing environment. It basically refers to the familial system of support and care of the elderly. In the absence of a well-developed system for providing social services to the elderly, they have to rely on persons living in their close proximity. The elderly expect economic, social, and emotional support from family members as their economic productivity and physical strength decline with advancing years. Thus, living arrangements become an important constituent of the overall well-being of the elderly and provide some indication of the level of actual support available to them. The theme has received major attention from demographers, anthropologists, sociologists, and economists due to the contribution of three interrelated factors. First, the rapidity and the demographic inevitability of aging in the developed world and its even more accelerated pace in countries who experienced recent demographic transitions. Secondly, the increasing availability of data and deployment of procedures to extract information from older sources and to analyze new ones. And third, an upsurge of research in the economics of intergenerational transfers, an area that for a long time was inextricably linked to the explanation of fertility changes, but that now paradoxically experiences a revival to understand the consequences, not the causes of fertility change. Asia has world's largest number of elderly, that is 53% after Europe, which has 25%. This pressure of increasing numbers of elderly will intensify in the next 50 years. In 2050, 82% of the world's elderly will be in developing regions of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean region, while only 16% of them will reside in the developed regions of Europe and North America. Due to the unprecedented speed of socio-economic transformation in developing nations, old aged people face a number of changes in different aspects of living conditions. The needs and problems of the elderly vary significantly according to their age, socio-economic status, health, living status, and other such background characteristics. Now, we'll talk about determinants of living arrangements of older people. A number of factors have been advanced as important determinants of living arrangements, which majorly consist of demographic, socioeconomic, and cultural factors. The greater extent of residential independence among older people reflects to a large extent the trend of positive developments. For example, few previous studies claimed that recent improvements in male longevity meant that older women are more likely to remain living without a spouse in later life. Additionally, declines in disability at older ages may have led to greater residential independence. Finally, improvements in the financial situation of older people are associated with increases in solitary living in many industrialized countries. Trends in nupitality and fertility also plays an important role in affecting the choices of living arrangements among elderly. The availability of spouse is an important factor in influencing living arrangements and is largely determined by past marriage patterns and the incidence and duration of widowhood and divorce. Many of the previous studies have shown a positive association between fertility and living arrangements. Here, the positive association depicts that older individuals with more children are less likely to live alone than those individuals having less number of children. With reference to socio-economic factors, level of education and financial resources have been proposed as significant determinants of living arrangements of elder people. Higher level of education and financial resources tend to increase the likelihood of residential independence among older people. Researchers have suggested that increased income promotes independent living since privacy and autonomy, both of which are highly valued, can be achieved with adequate financial means. Most studies have shown that individuals, especially women, appear to add elder care and other family responsibilities to their portfolio of daily tasks without cutting back substantially on paid work or other competing obligations. There are numerous similarities in the demographic circumstances of older women across many countries, and therefore differences in living arrangements are likely to be partially explained by other factors. It has been suggested that culturally influenced norms concerning family responsibilities and obligations are extremely important in affecting living arrangements among older people. The extents to which the elderly live with their next generation, considerable differences are apparent across different countries. For example, in northwestern Europe countries, there is a stronger individualistic culture involving looser and less geographically close familial ties and greater emphasis on individualistic relationships. Whereas in many of the South Asian countries, elderly still live their offspring's cultural values reflected in differences in the desirability of intergenerational contact, frequency of contact with kin, and provision of care to older relatives are also likely to induce variations across countries in patterns of household composition. Additionally, the many physiological, emotional, and interpersonal facets of aging influence the social functioning and well being of individuals in a variety of ways. The ongoing changes in traditional values, mobility of the younger generation, altered family structure, and role of women have contributed many living problems of the elderly. Many facets of the generation gap also contribute to the marginalization of older persons and their wisdom by the younger generation, leading to conflicts, lack of respect, decline of authority, neglect, and sometimes even exploitation or abuse. Now we will discuss the effect of modernization on elderly living arrangements. Theories about elderly living arrangements in Asian countries have emphasized on the effect of modernization and culture. Modernization theory have focused on the effects of technological advancement, industrialization, modern education, and functional specialization on aging and the family. The impact of modernization on aging and elderly living arrangements can be explained by the following points. Under the influence of modernization, health sector was developed which increased the longevity of individuals. This has resulted in prolonged retirement of the elderly, which is often accompanied by a significant loss of income and social prestige. Modernization gave impetus to industrialization, which in turn required a separation of work from home and a highly mobile workforce. This resulted into weakening of familial ties to a particular geographical area. Modern education has led to changes in values and intellectual development across generations. Younger people have come to place greater emphasis on self fulfillment as individuals rather than on their responsibilities towards their older kin. Increased specialization in social institutions, reduced traditional family functions, and family gathering events. Modernization makes extended family living less essential and economically less advantageous and thus facilitates the transition to nuclear family living arrangement. As a result of modernization, fewer elderly persons live with their married offsprings. These changes profoundly altered the living arrangements of people across the countries. Living arrangements of elderly among Asia with special reference to India. In Asian countries, the filial piety and a strong sense of obligation towards parents and elderly alike are still widespread and dominant. These cultural prescriptions translate into norms of support that reinforce intergenerational transfers toward the elderly and produce a robust tendency to live with parents. In China, still three generation family continue to be an important family type. Around half of the persons aged 60 years and above lived in three generation household. In mid 1980s, half of the elderly in Japan lived with their married children. Though this proportion is declining, but the process seems to be very slow. Some studies also argues that the number of elderly persons living alone or with their spouse is gradually increasing in developing world also, though the magnitude is slow. In India, the family has been the traditional social institution for the support, social security, and the care of the elderly. The practice of taking care of the elderly by family members has been followed over generations. In ancient India, aged persons had a vital role to play in the family and in society. They also enjoy social security against infirmities, losses, and had the privilege of being cared for by the younger generations. They were accorded a high status as decision makers in the joint family system. Over the years, changes have been taking place in the socio-economic and demographic dimensions. The ongoing phenomenon of globalization and urbanization has cast their shadow on values and norms of traditional society. A number of changes had their impact on the traditional family system, such as reduction in the number of children a couple can have, a higher life expectancy, greater involvement of younger women who have been the chief caretakers of the elderly in economic activities outside the home, physical separation of parents and adult children caused by urbanization and age, selective rural to urban area migration, spread of Western culture and lifestyle, and growing individualism as shown in the figure. All these major and minor changes gradually transformed Indian society from the joint family to the nuclear family system. These changes had profound implications for the support and care of the elderly. According to a research conducted in the Philippines, many older people, although co-residing with children, would prefer to live alone or with spouse only. They live with offsprings either because of their needs or the needs of their children or a combination of both. Now, the living arrangements of elderly among Europe and USA. In most of the European countries, the older population is primarily of females, largely a result of sex differences in mortality. Historical studies of household composition among older people in Europe earlier than 1970 indicate low level of older men and women living alone in comparison with recent time, although even these levels are high in comparison with those found in non-Western populations. However, variations in household composition have remained. Multi-generational households continue to be more prevalent in southern than in northwestern Europe. The trend of older people living alone, observed in many developed countries, has often been attributed to the better economic resources of the older population, which has enabled them to act on their preference for independent living. More recent research in Italy and USA showed a reversal of earlier trends towards solitary living among older unmarried women. This reversal was attributed to the following factors. Firstly, rise in the proportion of older people living in couple only households due to both increases in the survivorship of partners and consequent rises in the proportions of married among the young elderly age groups, increase in the availability of kin with whom older people may co-reside, a result of high fertility among cohorts born in the 1930s and 1940s compared with those born around the turn of the last century. Later ages at leaving the parental home among the younger generation in southern Europe, a result of longer periods of education, later marriage, and a later stable working career. The figure shows the proportion of women aged 65 and over living alone in private households during 1970s to 2000. Figure shows the sex-wise distribution of living arrangement of household populations in different parts of Europe and USA. Figure shows the sex-wise distribution of people aged 85 and over resident in communal establishments in the year 1990s or 91 and 2000 to 2001. Many European countries experienced increase in their institutionalized population in the 1980s. The policy response to this expansion was new legislation implemented in 1993, which was intended to reaffirm the objective of allowing older people to remain in their own homes for as long as possible. Sweden, Netherlands, and a number of other countries have also implemented explicit policy objectives to reduce institutional care use. Cross-sectional trends since the early 1950s clearly indicate that the patterns of living arrangements among the elderly of the United States have changed considerably. In general, these trends can be characterized as slight decreases in the incidence of living with relatives of most interest, sizable increase in the incidence of primary individuals and those institutionalized. These trends are particularly strong among the very old, that is, those who are over 75 years of age. The recent decline in institutionalization in the USA has been attributed in part to increased use of home care and the development of new housing types, including assisted living units. The present table shows the living arrangement of persons 60 years and over by age in the United States during the 1970s. Living arrangement of elderly among Australia. In Australia, older people in private dwelling tend to live a reasonably enjoyable life. Most of the people feel comfortable financially and consider their housing to be adequate for their needs. They also function at least as well as other age groups in terms of the truncated measure of mental health and indicate high satisfaction with life. In terms of vitality and social functioning, elderly, aged between 65 to 74, appear to be doing as well as most other age groups. The stage of life characterized by severe incapacity and dependency is rare among those under 80 and is typically brief if it occurs at all. Furthermore, compared with older people who live with others, those who lived alone was reported significantly lower well-being in some areas. The table shows the living arrangement of older people by age in Australia according to 2001 census. It is apparent from the above literature that in developed countries, new ideas, attitudes, and demographic behavior are not restricted to young adult persons but are also found in the lives of persons aged 50 and over. New behavioral patterns such as divorce and living alone, unmarried cohabitation are becoming more widespread among the elderly in Europe in accordance with the central ideas of the second demographic transition, that is, replacement of older norms, values, and behavioral patterns by new ones caused and supported by in depth socio cultural socio-structural, and technical changes that are taking place at the broader national and international level. These trends started in the countries of northwestern Europe, followed at some distance by the southern European countries. On the other hand, older people in most of the developing countries tend to live in large households, and they are likely to be living with an adult child who is more likely to be male than female. However, there is a substantial variation in the living arrangements by gender and education, and several regional patterns exist. Estimates based on unweighted country average indicate that nearly 1 in 10 older adults live alone, and the probability of living alone is greater for older women than men. Women are much less likely to live with a spouse or to head the household, whereas a slightly greater proportion of older women than men live with adult children. Now, we'll summarize what we have done till now. Living arrangements are influenced by a variety of factors, including marital status, financial well being, health status, family size, structure, as well as cultural traditions such as kinship patterns, the value placed on living independently or with family members, the availability of social services and social support, and the physical features of housing stock and local communities. In turn, living arrangements affect life satisfaction, health, and the chances of institutionalization, most importantly for those living in the community. Thus, the study of living arrangement of elderly assume greater significance in order to assess their status and condition in the society or the country. Changes over time in living arrangements and caregiving pattern of elderly appear as response to changes in other spheres of life of elderly. Demographic trends in fertility, mortality, migration have an impact on family size, household structure, especially as these trends interact with changing gender roles, increased education, expanding employment opportunities. Some significant observations emerge from a cross national comparison of living arrangements of the older population. First, women in developed countries are much more likely than men to live alone as they age. Older men are likely to live in family settings, typically with a spouse. Secondly, there have been an increase in the proportion of older population that is living alone in the developing countries. Thirdly, both older men and women in developing countries usually live with their adult children. Fourthly, the use of non family institutions for care of the frail elderly varies widely around the world, but it is relatively low everywhere. In older institutionalized countries, current elderly cohorts have lived through a complexity of 20th century changes, and this is reflected in the pattern and diversity of living arrangements that have emerged. The major question today in industrialized societies is whether that observed trends in living and care arrangements will continue. In less industrialized countries, many of the social changes associated with modern economic development are fairly recent phenomenon. The overarching questions in these countries is whether the basic family structure will come to resemble those of the so-called Western model. These questions have policy implications as government and other agencies grapple with how best to plan for the inevitable growth in the older population. The knowledge of the characteristic of the living arrangement of elderly can provide subsidies for the detection of vulnerable groups that can need to be prioritized in health care by the primary care professionals, including nurses. Therefore, there is a need to go beyond the descriptive statistics on living arrangements to investigate the factors that influence one's living arrangements and explore the impact those different living arrangements have on older people's lives. Thank you.